Ну, я как бы, вот если я скажу просто, у меня есть так желание, это не совсем искренне.
For centuries, violence against women has often been minimized, ignored, or explained away. Sometimes it is framed as passion, sometimes as opportunity, sometimes as madness. But at its core, many of these crimes are driven by misogyny, not always spoken out loud, but present in the patterns, in who is chosen, in how the violence unfolds, in how long it is allowed to continue. This is not a story about monsters born in the dark. It is a factual account of serial killers who hunted women again and again across different countries and decades. The details are disturbing, not because they are exaggerated, but because they are real. Everything you are about to hear is grounded in documented facts. If you find this kind of documentary important, consider subscribing. It helps these stories remain visible. Benjamin Atkins, 1991, Detroit and Highland Park, Michigan. Benjamin Thomas Atkins did not arrive in Detroit as a stranger. He was born there in late August the 19th. At 68 and spent much of his early life moving through institutions, shelters, and unstable homes. By the time his crimes began, he was already deeply embedded in the margins of the city. This context matters, not as an excuse, but as a documented backdrop to what followed. Atkins grew up in extreme instability. His parents struggled with addiction, and he was abandoned at a young age. He spent years in an orphanage, where records and later testimony describe physical abuse and sexual assault. As a teenager and young adult, Atkins drifted between homelessness, low-wage jobs, and drug use. According to people who knew him, his behavior toward women became increasingly hostile over time. Investigators later described his worldview as openly misogynistic, a fact supported by both witness statements and Atkins' own confessions. By late 1991, women began disappearing along the Woodward Corridor in Detroit and neighboring Highland Park. Most were women already living precarious lives. Several struggled with addiction. Some were involved in sex work. Others were simply poor and transient. These factors would later play a role in how slowly the pattern was recognized. The first body was discovered in mid-December 1991. 31-year-old Debbie Ann Friday was found inside an abandoned building. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. At the time, her death was treated as an isolated incident. Detroit had no shortage of abandoned structures, and violent crime was already high. The warning signs did not immediately coalesce. Within weeks, another woman was found, then another. By the end of January 1992, 4 women had been discovered dead in similar conditions. Each had been lured into abandoned buildings. Each had been assaulted. Each had been strangled. The locations varied, but the method remained consistent. Atkins' approach was simple and predatory. He targeted women he believed no one would search for, aggressively. He gained their trust by offering shelter, drugs, or money. Once inside abandoned houses or hotels, he attacked. There was no attempt to conceal the bodies beyond leaving them where they fell. In several cases, the remains were not discovered for weeks or months. On February 17, 1992, the scale of the violence became impossible to ignore. 3 women were found dead in different rooms of the same abandoned hotel in Highland Park. Valerie Chalk, Juanita Hardy, and an unidentified woman had all been sexually assaulted and strangled. The discovery sent shockwaves through local law enforcement, but by then, Atkins had already been active for months. Despite the growing number of victims, Atkins remained free. He was questioned once in January after being found inside an abandoned building, but he was released due to lack of evidence. This moment would later be viewed as a critical failure. At the time, there was still no confirmed suspect, and the victims' backgrounds contributed to a lack of urgency. The murders continued into the spring and summer. Brenda Mitchell, Vicki Beasley Brown, and Joanne O'Rourke were among those killed. Beasley Brown stood out because she was older and did not fit the typical profile investigators had formed. Her murder confirmed that Atkins' violence was not limited to a single category of woman. The common factor was not age or lifestyle, but vulnerability. Atkins was finally stopped in August 1992, not because of the murders, but because of a rape. A surviving victim identified him on the street and contacted police. During interrogation, Atkins initially denied involvement in any killings. He claimed to be homosexual and insisted he could not have committed the crimes. After hours of questioning, investigators presented him with details only the killer would know. Atkins began to talk. What followed was a full confession to 11 murders. He described the women, the locations, and the acts with disturbing clarity. He led police to additional crime scenes and confirmed suspicions that had lingered for months. At trial, Atkins was convicted of 11 counts of first-degree murder and multiple counts of criminal sexual conduct. Prosecutors emphasized the consistency of his actions and the clear pattern of targeting women he believed society had already abandoned. Psychological evaluations introduced in court documented his deep hostility toward women, particularly those he associated with his mother and with sex work. In 1994, Atkins was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He died 3 years later from complications related to AIDS. He was 29 years old. Benjamin Atkins did not hide his crimes behind complexity or sophistication. His violence thrived on neglect. His victims were not unseen because they were unknown, but because they were overlooked. The facts of the case make that clear. 11. Women were murdered in less than 1 year. The pattern was visible. The response was slow. Benjamin Atkins was stopped because one woman survived long enough to identify him. His crimes ended when visibility replaced neglect. But in other places, killers learned how to operate even more freely. Some did not hide in abandoned buildings. Some wore uniforms. Some were trusted by the very systems meant to protect. The next case takes us thousands of miles away, into a different country, a different decade, and a different position of power. Mikhail Popkov, 1992, Angarsk, Irkutsk Oblast, Russia. When the murders attributed to Mikhail Viktorovich Popkov began, there was no single crime scene that alarmed the public, no sudden spike that triggered panic. Instead, women began vanishing one by one from the streets of Angarsk, a quiet industrial city in eastern Siberia. At first, their deaths appeared disconnected, different locations, different circumstances. But over time, a pattern emerged that investigators would fail to fully recognize for nearly 2 decades. Popkov was born in March 1964 and spent most of his adult life in Angarsk. He was married, had a daughter, and worked first as a police officer and later as a security guard. His position placed him in uniform, in a marked vehicle, and in routine contact with the public. This authority would become central to how his crimes unfolded. The first confirmed murders occurred in 1992. Women were found dead on the outskirts of Angarsk or in wooded areas nearby. Most were killed late at night. Many had accepted a ride home. Several were later determined to have encountered a man in a police uniform shortly before their deaths. Popkov used trust as a weapon. He approached women he judged as vulnerable, often those walking alone after social gatherings. Wearing his uniform, he offered them a lift. For his victims, there was no immediate reason to refuse. A police officer represented safety, order, protection. Instead, Popkov drove them to remote locations. There, he forced them to undress. He killed them using whatever tools were available, including knives, axes, screwdrivers, and blunt instruments. Afterward, he mutilated their bodies. In many cases, he committed sexual acts after death. The brutality was extreme, but it remained largely unseen. Over the years, dozens of women were murdered across Angarsk and surrounding regions. The victims ranged in age from their late teens to middle adulthood. Some were sex workers, others were not. What connected them was Popkov's personal judgment. He later stated that he targeted women he believed behaved immorally, women who drank, women who socialized without male supervision, women he believed deserved punishment. For years, the investigation stalled. Bodies were discovered sporadically. Some deaths were initially classified as accidents or isolated homicides. Others were linked only loosely by circumstance. Despite recurring similarities, Popkov continued his work, often participating indirectly in the investigations themselves as a police officer. The murders continued through the 1990s and into the 2000s. By this point, Angarsk had developed an unspoken fear. Women altered their routines. Parents warned their daughters not to walk alone at night. Still, no suspect emerged. It was not until 2012 that the case finally began to collapse inward. Investigators revisited old evidence and noticed a recurring detail at multiple crime scenes: tire tracks consistent with a police-issued vehicle. This discovery narrowed the field dramatically. Authorities ordered DNA testing for thousands of current and former police officers in the region. Popkov initially resisted, claiming technical issues and delaying submission. When his DNA was finally collected, it matched samples recovered from multiple victims. He was arrested in June 2012. During interrogation, Popkov confessed. At first, he admitted to a limited number of murders. As the questioning continued, the number grew. Eventually, he confessed to more than 90 killings. Investigators were able to confirm many of these through physical evidence and recovered remains. In court, Popkov described his actions with disturbing detachment. He stated that he believed he was cleansing society. He expressed no remorse for the women he killed. Psychological evaluations introduced at trial documented extreme misogyny and a rigid moral framework centered on control and punishment. In 2015, Popkov was convicted of 22 murders and sentenced to life in prison. In subsequent years, additional convictions followed as more cases were formally linked to him. He received a second life sentence after further confessions and confirmations. Mikhail Popkov is now recognized as the most prolific serial killer in Russian history. His crimes spanned nearly 20 years. They occurred while he lived an outwardly ordinary life. They continued because his authorities shielded him, and because his victims were not immediately believed to be connected. Popkov did not rely on anonymity. He relied on legitimacy. His uniform opened doors, his badge silenced suspicion, and for years it allowed him to hunt women openly under the appearance of protection. As the investigation into Popkov finally closed, one truth became impossible to ignore. The danger did not always come from abandoned buildings or hidden spaces. Sometimes it came from the front seat of a marked vehicle, and in the next case, the violence would again cross borders, following highways instead of city streets, carried not by authority, but by movement itself. Keith Hunter Jesperson. Keith Hunter Jesperson's crimes did not unfold in one city or even one state. They stretched across highways, truck stops, rural roads, and multiple jurisdictions, exploiting distance, mobility, and institutional fragmentation. By the time authorities fully understood what they were dealing with, several women were already dead, and at least one innocent person had falsely confessed to a murder Jesperson committed. Jesperson was born in April 1955 in British Columbia, Canada. His early life was marked by documented instability and violence. Records and later testimony describe a childhood that included severe physical punishment and repeated incidents of cruelty toward animals. These behaviors were not hidden, they were known. But no intervention prevented what came next. As an adult, Jesperson became a long-haul truck driver. The job offered him exactly what he needed: constant movement, anonymity, and access to vulnerable women along major transport routes. Truck stops, roadside bars, and rest areas became his hunting grounds. The victims he chose were often women already living precarious lives, including sex workers and transient women. Their disappearances were less likely to trigger immediate, coordinated investigations. The first confirmed murder occurred in January 1990 near Portland, Oregon. Jesperson met Tanya Bennett at a bar. Later that night, after an argument, he strangled her with his hands and disposed of her body along a rural road. When Bennett's remains were discovered, the case took a devastating turn. A local woman, Laverne Pavlinak, and her boyfriend falsely confessed to the crime. They provided details investigators believed only the killer could know. Jesperson remained free while two innocent people were charged. This false confession deeply influenced Jesperson's behavior. Rather than lying low, he became angry that someone else was receiving attention for his crime. He wanted recognition. He wanted acknowledgement. This desire would shape the next phase of his crimes. Jesperson began writing anonymous letters to law enforcement and media outlets. In them, he described the murder of Tanya Bennett in explicit detail. He signed the letters with crude drawings of smiley faces. When authorities compared the details in the letters with evidence from the crime scene, they realized the real killer was still at large. Jesperson had successfully inserted himself into the investigation without revealing his identity. Between 1990 and 1995, Jesperson murdered at least 8 women across the United States. Confirmed victims were killed in Oregon, California, Washington, Wyoming, Nebraska, and Florida. The murders shared key characteristics. Jesperson typically met his victims casually, often offering rides or companionship. He strangled them, usually with his hands, and disposed of their bodies in remote locations such as ravines, wooded areas, or along highways. Several of the deaths were initially misclassified. In at least one case, a victim's death was ruled a drug overdose. In another, the killing was treated as an isolated act of violence, unrelated to any larger pattern. Jesperson relied on this misclassification. Each incorrect ruling bought him more time. Throughout this period, Jesperson continued to communicate with authorities. His letters grew more frequent and more taunting. He complained about being ignored. He criticized law enforcement. He described killings that had not yet been publicly linked. These communications forced investigators in different states to begin comparing notes, but coordination was slow. Jurisdictional boundaries worked in his favor. One of the most significant consequences of Jesperson's actions was the wrongful imprisonment of Laverne Pavlinak. She spent years incarcerated for a murder she did not commit. It was only after Jesperson's arrest and full confession that her conviction was overturned. The damage, however, had already been done. Jesperson was finally arrested in March 1995 for the murder of Julie Winningham in Washington state. Physical evidence tied him directly to the crime. Faced with this evidence, he confessed. Once in custody, he began providing information about other murders, some already known, others not. Investigators verified his statements carefully, separating confirmed facts from unsubstantiated claims. Jesperson claimed responsibility for far more murders than could be proven. Authorities ultimately confirmed 8 victims based on physical evidence, corroborated details, and recovered remains. All confirmed victims were women. Claims beyond those cases remain excluded from the official record due to lack of verification. At trial, Jesperson was convicted of aggravated murder and additional homicide charges. He received multiple life sentences. He will not be eligible for parole for decades. Psychological evaluations introduced during sentencing documented a pattern of narcissism, control, and hostility toward women. But the court focused on actions, not interpretation. What distinguishes Jesperson's case is not only the number of victims, but the way he weaponized attention. He was not content with secrecy. He wanted acknowledgement. He wanted his victims to be remembered as evidence of his power, rather than as individuals whose lives mattered. His misogyny expressed itself through humiliation as much as violence. Jesperson's crimes exposed systemic weaknesses. Separate jurisdictions failed to connect cases quickly. Early misclassifications delayed recognition. Vulnerable victims were not prioritized. The record shows that these failures were not inevitable. They were the result of structural gaps that Jesperson understood and exploited. By the time the full scope of his crimes became clear, years had passed. Families had been given incorrect answers. Investigations had stalled. Trust had been eroded. Jesperson's case forced law enforcement agencies across the country to confront how easily serial violence against women could be scattered across maps and databases, effectively hidden in plain sight. As his sentencing concluded, authorities reopened multiple cold cases, reviewing evidence with renewed scrutiny. Some answers were found, many were not. The confirmed facts remain limited to what could be proven beyond doubt. Jesperson's violence followed highways and truck routes, moving faster than information could travel. And while his crimes depended on distance and fragmentation, the next case would reveal a different approach entirely, one rooted not in movement, but in charm, familiarity, and the illusion of safety itself. Glen Edward Rogers, 1993, United States. Glen Edward Rogers did not rely on authority, uniforms, or long-term planning. His approach was simpler and, in many ways, more deceptive. He used charm. He used conversation. He used the assumption that danger looks obvious when it is close. For several women across multiple states, that assumption proved fatal. Rogers was born in July 1962 in Hamilton, Ohio. His early life was marked by instability, school expulsion, and documented violence. By his early 20s, he already had a history of assault and abuse. Court records later showed allegations of domestic violence during his first marriage. These details were known to people around him, but they did not prevent what followed. By the early 1990s, Rogers was drifting across the United States. He had no fixed residence, no consistent employment, and no stable relationships. He moved easily between states, often staying with acquaintances or temporary partners. This transient lifestyle allowed him to appear briefly in people's lives and disappear just as quickly. The first murder conclusively linked to Rogers occurred in January 1993. The victim was a man, Mark Peters, in Ohio. However, what followed established a clear and documented pattern of violence against women. Beginning in 1995, Rogers targeted women in multiple states, often meeting them in social settings where trust formed quickly. In September 1995, 33-year-old Sandra Gallagher met Rogers at a bar in Van Nuys, California. Witnesses later confirmed they left together. The next day, Gallagher's burned body was found inside her truck near Rogers' apartment. She had been strangled. Evidence placed Rogers with her shortly before her death. This murder would later lead to his conviction in California. After killing Gallagher, Rogers fled west to east, leaving a trail of victims behind him. In Mississippi, 34-year-old Linda Price disappeared after meeting Rogers. She was found dead in her apartment bathtub. In Florida, 33-year-old Tina Marie Cribbs was last seen leaving a bar with Rogers. Her body was discovered days later, also in a bathtub, stabbed and killed. Fingerprints and physical evidence tied Rogers directly to the scene. Authorities later documented another victim in Louisiana, Andy Giles Sutton, whose body was found slashed inside her apartment. The sequence of killings followed a consistent rhythm. Rogers met women socially. He gained their trust quickly. He killed them indoors, often in places associated with privacy and safety. He then moved on before suspicion could catch up. Rogers did not hide his presence. He used his real name in many encounters. He spoke openly. He appeared confident. Several witnesses later described him as charismatic and calm. This demeanor delayed alarm and complicated early investigations. In November 1995, Rogers was finally arrested in Kentucky after a police chase. He was driving Tina Marie Cribbs' stolen car. Inside the vehicle, officers found evidence linking him to multiple crimes. Once in custody, Rogers made a series of claims that further complicated his case. He told investigators he had killed dozens of people. At one point, he claimed nearly 70 victims. These statements were later partially retracted. Law enforcement agencies across the country investigated his claims carefully. Only murders supported by physical evidence and corroboration were included in the official record. Rogers was convicted of murder in Florida and California. He received death sentences in both states. His confirmed female victims included Sandra Gallagher, Linda Price, Tina Marie Cribbs, and Andy Giles Sutton. Other suspected cases remain unresolved or unproven and are excluded from factual accounting. Throughout his trials, prosecutors emphasized Rogers' pattern of targeting women who trusted him quickly. There was no indication of random violence. Each murder followed personal contact, conversation, proximity. The violence occurred after trust had already been established. Rogers spent nearly 3 decades on death row. His appeals focused on procedural issues rather than claims of innocence. In May 2025, he was executed by lethal injection in Florida. Glen Rogers' crimes demonstrate how violence does not always announce itself. There were no abandoned buildings, no uniforms, no forced entries. His victims were not taken by surprise in dark alleys. They were killed in spaces where they believed they were safe. The documented facts show a killer who relied on social access rather than concealment. He crossed state lines faster than information could follow. Each jurisdiction saw only a fragment. By the time the fragments were connected, several women were already dead. Rogers did not need anonymity. He needed only a moment of trust. And in the next case, that trust would again be exploited, but with a different outcome. One that ended not with flight, but with a killer walking directly into a police station, carrying proof of what he had done. Wayne Adam Ford, 1997, California. Wayne Adam Ford's crimes did not come to light through investigative breakthroughs or long-term surveillance. They ended because he chose to stop them himself. What led up to that moment, however, was a sequence of documented violence against women that unfolded quietly across California and neighboring states, hidden behind mobility, mental instability, and repeated failures to intervene. Ford was born in December 1961 in Petaluma, California. His early life included multiple head injuries. one in early childhood and another in late adolescence when he was struck by a drunk driver and left in a coma for several days. Medical records and later evaluations noted a significant change in personality after this incident. Over the years, Ford was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and experienced repeated psychological decline. By the 1980s and early 1990s, Ford had a documented history of violence. He was arrested for animal cruelty. He was accused of assaulting sex workers. He struggled to maintain employment and relationships. These incidents were recorded, addressed in isolation, and then released back into the system. In the mid-1990s, Ford began working as a long-haul truck driver. Like others before him, this gave him access to transient populations and allowed him to move between locations without drawing attention. His victims were women he encountered during his routes, many of whom were engaged in sex work or living unstable lives. The first confirmed murder occurred in 1997. A woman, later identified as Carrie Ann Cummings, was killed and dismembered. At the time, her remains were discovered without identification and classified as a Jane Doe. It would take more than 2 decades for her identity to be confirmed through forensic genealogy. The delay meant that her death did not immediately connect to any broader pattern. Over the following year, Ford murdered additional women. Tina Renee Gibbs, Lynette Deon White, and Patricia Ann Tamiz were all killed in separate incidents. Ford strangled his victims and, in several cases, dismembered their bodies. The remains were left in remote locations, aqueducts, or waterways, often far from where the killings occurred. Each murder was initially treated as an isolated crime. Different jurisdictions handled different discoveries. There was no immediate indication that the same person was responsible. Ford relied on this fragmentation. He moved, worked, and killed without immediate consequence. What separates Ford from many other killers is how his crimes ended. On November 3, 1998, Ford walked into the Humboldt County Sheriff's Department. He was accompanied by his brother. In his pocket, he carried a severed human breast. He told officers that he was a serial killer and that he needed help before he killed again. This act was not symbolic. It was evidence. Investigators initially struggled to comprehend what they were hearing. Ford provided detailed confessions to 4 murders. He described locations, methods, and disposal sites. As police verified his statements, the confessions were confirmed. Physical evidence matched his accounts. During interrogation, Ford did not deny his actions. He described escalating violence driven by anger, resentment, and psychological instability. Court records show no attempt to minimize his responsibility. His admissions became central to the prosecution's case. At trial, Ford was convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances. Prosecutors emphasized the brutality of the crimes and the clear pattern of targeting women. Psychological testimony addressed his mental health history, but it did not absolve him of responsibility. He was sentenced to death. Ford remains on death row in California. The documented record shows a killer whose violence escalated despite repeated warning signs. Prior arrests, hospitalizations, diagnoses. Each moment represented an opportunity for intervention that did not occur. His victims were not random. They were women he believed he could dominate and discard without immediate consequence. Ford's case also highlights how identification delays affect accountability. One of his victims remained unnamed for more than 25 years. Without a name, there was no family to push for answers, no history to examine, no missing person report to connect. That absence mattered. When Ford turned himself in, the killings stopped. Not because the system caught up, but because he chose to surrender. The facts make that distinction unavoidable. Unlike killers who were exposed through DNA or long-term investigations, Ford's case ended with a confession delivered directly to law enforcement. It was a rare conclusion, but it did not undo what had already happened. Wayne Adam Ford hunted women across roads and routes meant to move goods, not violence. His crimes show how easily documented warning signs can be compartmentalized, and how long a killer can operate when those signs are never fully connected. And while Ford's story ends inside a police station, the next case returns to a familiar pattern, one where violence persisted for years, unnoticed and underestimated, because the victims themselves were not treated as urgent. Lonnie David Franklin Jr. 1984, Los Angeles, California. Lonnie David Franklin Jr. operated in plain sight for decades. His crimes did not unfold quickly, nor did they follow a short, intense spree. Instead, they stretched across more than 20 years, marked by long periods of silence and sudden returns to violence. This stop-start pattern would later earn him the nickname that defined the case, the Grim Sleeper. Franklin was born in August 1952 and grew up in south-central Los Angeles. He married, had children, and lived an outwardly ordinary life. Beneath that surface, however, was a documented history of violence. In the 1970s, Franklin was convicted in Germany for the kidnapping and gang rape of a teenage girl while serving in the United States Army. He was dishonorably discharged after serving time in prison. This conviction placed him on record as a violent sexual offender long before his later crimes began. By the mid-1980s, women in South Los Angeles began to die under similar circumstances. Most were found shot at close range or strangled. Many were black women. Many struggled with addiction. Several were involved in sex work. At first, the cases appeared disconnected. Los Angeles was large. Violence was common. Patterns took time to emerge. By 1985, investigators believed a serial killer was targeting women in south-central Los Angeles. The suspect was initially referred to as the South Side Slayer. Law enforcement linked multiple murders based on location, victim profile, and forensic evidence. Despite this, the investigation moved slowly. Families of victims later described a lack of urgency, citing the social status of the women who had been killed. Between 1984 and 1988, at least 10 women were murdered in this series. One woman survived an attack and later became a key witness. She described a man who appeared calm, neat, and unthreatening. Her description did not immediately lead to an arrest. Then, without explanation, the killings stopped. For nearly 14 years, no murders matching the same pattern were confirmed. Investigators debated whether the killer had died, been incarcerated for another crime, or simply moved on. The case grew cold. Task forces were disbanded. Files were archived. In 2002, the violence resumed. Women began dying again under circumstances nearly identical to the earlier murders. Ballistic evidence linked new killings to those from the 1980s. The same firearm had been used. The Grim Sleeper had returned. This time, investigators approached the case differently. Advances in forensic science allowed them to extract DNA from crime scenes. The problem was that Franklin's DNA was not in any database. Despite previous felony convictions, his genetic profile had never been collected due to administrative gaps in California's DNA collection policies during earlier years. The breakthrough came through familial DNA. In 2008, Franklin's son was convicted of a felony weapons charge. His DNA was entered into the system. Analysts noticed similarities between his profile and the DNA recovered from the murder scenes. This did not identify Franklin directly, but it narrowed the suspect pool to a close male relative. Investigators placed Franklin under surveillance. They collected discarded items from him in public spaces, including pizza crusts and utensils. DNA obtained from these items matched samples from the crime scenes. In July 2010, Lonnie David Franklin Jr. was arrested. Inside his home, investigators found hundreds of photographs. Many depicted women, some nude, some unconscious. Authorities could not immediately determine who the women were or whether they were victims. The images were released publicly in an effort to identify them. The scale of the discovery suggested that the known victims may not represent the full extent of Franklin's violence. Franklin was charged with 10 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. The victims included women killed during both phases of his crimes, before and after the long gap. All confirmed victims were women. One survived an attempted killing and testified at trial. During court proceedings, prosecutors emphasized the continuity of Franklin's actions, the same weapon, the same victim profile, the same geographic focus. The 14-year gap was never explained by Franklin, and no confirmed evidence established where he was or why he stopped during that time. In 2016, Franklin was convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to death. He died in prison in 2020, before the sentence could be carried out. The Grim Sleeper case exposed systemic failures that went beyond one individual. Investigators later acknowledged that early reluctance to publicly warn the community played a role in allowing the killings to continue. Activists had raised concerns in the 1980s, arguing that the deaths of poor black women were not being treated with the same urgency as other serial cases. Those concerns are now part of the documented history. Franklin's crimes show how violence can persist when victims are not prioritized. The facts demonstrate that the killer did not rely on disguise, mobility, or authority. He relied on indifference, on the assumption that certain lives would not trigger sustained outrage. When the case finally closed, it did so not because the killings were short, but because forensic technology caught up to decades of neglect. Familial DNA succeeded where traditional methods had failed. Lonnie David Franklin Jr. hunted women across generations. His crimes survived task force closures, administrative gaps, and institutional hesitation. The record does not show a mystery. It shows a long trail of warning signs that were not acted on quickly enough. And while the Grim Sleeper's story unfolded slowly over decades, the next case would reveal a different timeline entirely, one defined not by years of silence, but by relentless repetition, carried out by a killer who left records of his crimes and waited decades before facing justice. Joseph Naso, 1974, California. Joseph Naso's crimes did not erupt suddenly, nor were they contained within a short span of time. They unfolded slowly, across decades, moving through different cities and eras, while leaving behind a trail of young women whose deaths were not fully understood until many years later. His case demonstrates how time itself can shield violence, especially when patterns are not recognized and evidence is allowed to fragment. Naso was born in January 1934 in Rochester, New York. By the 1970s, he was living in California, moving between San Francisco, the Bay Area, and later other parts of the state. He presented himself as an educated man, taking college classes and working as a freelance photographer. To some, he appeared eccentric but harmless. To investigators decades later, that persona would take on a far more sinister meaning. The first confirmed murder linked to Naso occurred in January 1974. Charlotte Cook, a 19-year-old woman, was killed in California. At the time, her death was not conclusively tied to any serial pattern. There were no immediate follow-ups, no connected cases. The investigation stalled. Over the next several years, more women disappeared. In 1976, Lynn Ruth Connors was last seen alive in Berkeley. She was later found strangled and discarded under a bridge. In 1977, Roxine Ragash Ashby was found dead near Fairfax, California. She had been strangled and left outdoors. Later that same year, Pamela Jean Lamson disappeared after agreeing to meet a man who had offered to photograph her at Fisherman's Wharf. She was never seen alive again. Each case was investigated individually. The similarities were subtle but present. Young women, private meetings, strangulation, bodies left in remote locations. Still, no single suspect emerged. In August 1978, the body of Carmen Lorraine Colon was discovered along a scenic highway. She had been dumped nude and left to decompose. In 1979, Rebecca Jean Dunn disappeared after traveling to California with the intention of earning money through sex work. Her remains were later linked to the same pattern. By the early 1980s, the number of suspected victims had grown. One woman, Sherilia Patton, was found dead after washing ashore in the Bay Area. Naso had known her personally and had taken photographs of her before her death. Investigators questioned him at the time. He gave evasive answers, but was not charged. There was not enough evidence to move forward. What investigators did not know then was that Naso had been keeping records. Naso documented aspects of his crimes through photographs and personal writings. These materials remained undiscovered for decades. Without them, law enforcement lacked the connective tissue needed to establish a serial pattern. Cases went cold, families waited, time passed. In the 1990s, additional women were killed. Sarah Dillon disappeared in 1992 while traveling to a concert. Her remains were later linked to Naso's movements. In 1993, Pamela Ruth Parsons was found dead in Yuba County. In 1994, Tracy Lynn Tafoya was murdered, drugged, sexually assaulted, and strangled. Her body was left near a cemetery. By this point, the span of crime stretched across 20 years. Still, Naso remained free. The turning point came in 2011. Naso was arrested in Reno. Nevada for unrelated offenses. During a search of his property, investigators found photographs, handwritten notes, and what was later described in court as a rape diary. The materials contained references to women whose deaths had never been solved. Forensic testing connected Naso to multiple cold cases. DNA evidence, combined with photographic documentation and travel records, allowed prosecutors to reconstruct a timeline that had previously been invisible. One by one, victims were linked. Patterns emerged that could no longer be dismissed. Naso was charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder. At trial, prosecutors presented evidence spanning decades. The jury heard how Naso targeted young women, often under the pretense of photography or companionship. He isolated them, strangled them, and disposed of their bodies in locations chosen to delay discovery. In 2013, Joseph Naso was convicted of 4 murders. Although investigators believe the true number of victims is higher, only cases supported by physical evidence were included. He was sentenced to death. What makes Naso's case particularly disturbing is not only the length of time over which he killed, but how close he came to detection early on. He was questioned, he was suspected, he was known to victims, and yet he remained free for decades. His crimes show how easily violence against women can be scattered across time until it no longer looks connected. When murders are separated by years instead of weeks, urgency fades, patterns blur, files close. Naso did not rely on speed or chaos. He relied on patience, on the assumption that time would erase memory, on the belief that young women who vanished quietly would not be prioritized indefinitely. The record shows that assumption was correct, at least for a while. Joseph Naso was not caught because someone finally noticed a sudden spike in murders. He was caught because unrelated circumstances exposed records he never intended to share. Without those materials, many of his victims might have remained nameless entries in unsolved files. His conviction came too late for the women he killed, but it forced a reckoning with decades of overlooked evidence. It demonstrated how long a serial killer can operate when crimes are isolated instead of connected, and when victims are treated as individual tragedies rather than part of a larger pattern. As Naso was sentenced, investigators acknowledged that his case was not unique. It was an extreme example of a broader failure to link violence against women across time and place. And while Naso's crimes stretched slowly across decades, the next case would unfold very differently. It would be defined not by silence and delay, but by visibility, panic, and a shocking realization that the killer everyone feared was not who authorities expected at all. Juana Barraza Samperio, 2003, Mexico City, Mexico. For years, authorities in Mexico City searched for a man. Witnesses described someone in women's clothing. Media speculation focused on disguise, deception, and the idea that a male offender was deliberately hiding in plain sight. This assumption shaped the investigation from the very beginning. It also delayed the truth. Juana Barraza Samperio was born in December 1957 in Hidalgo, Mexico. Her early life was marked by extreme abuse and neglect. Documented accounts state that, as a child, she was repeatedly assaulted after her mother traded her to a man in exchange for alcohol. This history is part of the official record, but it does not explain what followed. It only establishes that Barraza's life began in violence long before she inflicted it. As an adult, Barraza lived in Mexico City and worked intermittently in low-income jobs. She also competed as a professional wrestler under the name La Dama del Silencio. To neighbors and acquaintances, she appeared physically strong, reserved, and unremarkable. No one suspected she would become one of the most notorious serial killers in the country's history. The murders began quietly in the late 1990s. Elderly women living alone were found dead inside their homes. At first, the deaths were attributed to natural causes or accidents. Many victims were over 60 years old. Several had known medical conditions. There were no obvious signs of forced entry. Over time, similarities emerged. The women had been strangled or bludgeoned. Jewelry and small valuables were often missing. In some cases, items such as stethoscopes or cords were found near the bodies. The victims lived in similar neighborhoods and were socially isolated. The pattern became impossible to ignore. By 2003, Mexican media began referring to the killer as La Mataviejitas, translated as the little old lady killer. Public fear spread rapidly. Elderly women were warned not to open their doors to strangers. Authorities released profiles suggesting the killer posed as a government worker offering social services. Despite this, the investigation was plagued by misdirection. Police initially believed the killer was a man dressed as a woman. Several arrests were made based on this theory. None led to convictions. Meanwhile, the murders continued. Barraza gained access to her victims through trust. She knocked on doors. She spoke calmly. She claimed to represent social welfare programs or health services. Once inside, she attacked. Many victims were overpowered quickly due to age and physical frailty. The killings were personal and close range. There was no attempt to flee immediately. Barraza often lingered long enough to steal small items before leaving. The breakthrough came on January 25, 2006. Barraza was seen fleeing the home of Ana Maria de los Reyes Alfaro, an elderly woman found strangled with a stethoscope. Neighbors alerted police. Officers pursued and apprehended Barraza nearby. When questioned, she initially denied involvement. Fingerprint evidence quickly contradicted her statements. Once in custody, Barraza confessed to some of the killings, though she denied others. Forensic evidence tied her to at least 16 murders. Investigators believe the true number may be higher, but only confirmed cases were included in court proceedings. During trial, prosecutors laid out a consistent pattern. All victims were elderly women. All lived alone. All were killed inside their own homes. Barraza did not dispute the core facts. Psychological evaluations were presented, but the court focused on actions rather than motivation. In 2008, Juana Barraza Samperio was convicted of 16 murders and sentenced to 759 years in prison. She remains incarcerated. Public reaction was intense. Many expressed shock that the killer was a woman. Media narratives shifted abruptly. What had been framed as deception by disguise was revealed to be something far simpler. Trust had been exploited. Gender assumptions had misled the investigation. Barraza's case is significant not because she was a female serial killer, but because of how long that fact was considered impossible. Authorities searched for a man while evidence pointed elsewhere. The victims, elderly women living alone, were not initially treated as part of a coordinated attack. Their deaths were too easily explained away. The documented record shows that Barraza's crimes were enabled by social isolation and institutional blind spots. Her victims were not targeted randomly. They were selected because they were accessible, trusting, and unlikely to be immediately missed. Unlike other cases, Barraza did not rely on mobility or anonymity. She returned again and again to the same neighborhoods. She used conversation instead of force to gain entry. She did not hide behind authority or charm, but behind routine. Her arrest ended years of fear, but it also exposed how assumptions about gender delayed justice. The idea that a woman could not commit serial murder shaped decisions at every stage of the investigation. Juana Barraza Samperio hunted women who were already vulnerable. She entered their homes uninvited, but welcomed. The facts show a killer who relied on familiarity, not fear. And while her case forced authorities to confront their assumptions, the next chapter moves back across borders once more. There, violence against women would again unfold in abandoned spaces, hidden not by age or isolation, but by neglect, silence, and buildings no one was watching. Darren Deon Vann. 2013, Gary and Hammond, Indiana. By the time Darren Deon Vann was arrested, the evidence suggested something far worse than a single murder. Women had been disappearing for years in Gary, Indiana. Their bodies were found in abandoned houses, left in silence as neighborhoods emptied and buildings decayed. What made the case especially disturbing was not only the violence itself, but how long it took for anyone to connect the deaths. Vann was born in March 1971 in Indiana. As an adult, he lived a largely transient life, moving between states and relationships. Court records show a history of violence against women long before the murders began. In 2007, he committed a sexual assault in Austin, Texas, for which he was convicted and imprisoned. He was released in 2013. Within months, women in Indiana began to die. The confirmed killing that led to his arrest occurred in October 2014. 19-year-old Afrika Hardy was found strangled in a motel room in Hammond, Indiana. She had last been seen meeting a man she contacted through social media. Phone records led police directly to Darren Vann. When officers searched him, they found Hardy's phone in his possession. During interrogation, Vann confessed. He admitted to killing Hardy and told investigators there were more victims. He then led police to abandoned houses in Gary, Indiana. Inside these structures, officers discovered the remains of additional women. The locations were vacant, decaying, and largely ignored by the surrounding community. Some of the buildings had been empty for years. Ultimately, 7 murders were confirmed. All victims were women. Most were strangled. Some had been missing for extended periods before their bodies were found. Investigators believe the true number may be higher, but only cases supported by physical evidence were formally charged. What makes Vann's case particularly significant is that warnings existed long before his arrest. Years earlier, data analyst Thomas Hargrove identified a statistical cluster of unsolved female homicides in Gary. His findings suggested a serial killer was active. He repeatedly urged local authorities to investigate the pattern. His concerns were dismissed. Law enforcement officials stated there was no evidence of a serial offender. Even a deputy coroner raised alarms. Those warnings were also ignored. As a result, the murders continued. Vann's method was consistent. He contacted women through social media or personal connections. He met them privately. He strangled them. He then transported their bodies to abandoned buildings where discovery would be delayed. These were not random locations. They were chosen because they were empty, overlooked, and rarely entered. The victims shared common vulnerabilities. Many were young. Several faced economic instability. Some were involved in sex work. Their disappearances did not trigger immediate large-scale searches. Their deaths were not immediately connected. After his arrest, Vann was charged with multiple counts of murder. Prosecutors initially sought the death penalty. The legal process extended over several years due to motions, delays, and changes in judges. In 2018, Vann pleaded guilty to 7 murders. In exchange, the death penalty was removed. He was sentenced to 7 concurrent life sentences without the possibility of parole. During court proceedings, no evidence suggested remorse. Psychological evaluations were not central to the case. The focus remained on actions, locations, and victim identification. Each confirmed victim was named, each location documented. Vann is currently incarcerated. The documented facts of the case reveal more than one individual failure. They reveal a structural problem. The abandoned houses used to hide bodies were themselves symbols of neglect. Entire neighborhoods had been emptied by economic collapse. Buildings stood open, unsecured, and unseen. This environment allowed violence to remain hidden in plain sight. Equally troubling is how early warnings were dismissed. Data suggested a pattern. A professional coroner raised concerns. Those signals did not lead to action. Instead, women continued to die. Vann did not rely on disguise or authority. He relied on invisibility, on the assumption that abandoned spaces would not be searched, on the belief that missing women would not be prioritized. The record shows that assumption held true for years. His arrest did not come from pattern recognition. It came from a single murder that could not be ignored, a body found in a motel room, a phone traceable to a suspect. Without that, the killings may have continued. Darren Deon Vann hunted women in places already written off. His crimes were enabled by abandonment, both physical and institutional. The empty houses hid the bodies. The ignored warnings hid the pattern. When the case finally closed, it forced local authorities to acknowledge that signs had been there all along. The data was correct. The suspicions were justified. The failure was not in recognizing violence, but in responding to it. And while Vann's crimes were confined to a specific region, the next case would unfold almost entirely online. There, trust would be built through messages instead of meetings, and violence would enter through the front door of a small apartment in one of the world's most densely populated cities. Takahiro Shiraishi, 2017, Zama, Kanagawa Prefecture, Japan. Takahiro Shiraishi's crimes unfolded almost entirely out of sight, not because they were hidden in remote locations, but because they were carried out behind a closed apartment door. There were no abandoned buildings, no long travel routes, no extended timeline. What made the case shocking was how quickly it happened, how directly the victims were targeted, and how openly Shiraishi exploited vulnerability through the internet. Shiraishi was born in October 1990 in Tokyo. As a young adult, he struggled to maintain stable employment. Prior to the murders, he worked in Tokyo's red light district as a scout, recruiting women for sex work. Multiple reports described him as unsettling and manipulative. Eventually, he left Tokyo and moved to a small apartment in Zama, a commuter city southwest of the capital. In the summer of 2017, Shiraishi began using social media, primarily Twitter, to contact people expressing suicidal thoughts. His messages were direct. He told them he could help them die. In some cases, he offered to die alongside them. In others, he claimed he could simply listen and provide understanding. These statements are documented in court records and message histories recovered during the investigation. The victims responded because they were already in crisis. Between August and October 2017, 9 people were murdered. 8 were women. 1 was a man. All were between the ages of 15 and 26. Each victim had posted online about suicidal thoughts shortly before encountering Shiraishi. Shiraishi invited the victims to his apartment. He told them it was a safe place. Once inside, the outcome was always the same. He strangled them. He dismembered their bodies. He stored the remains in coolers and storage boxes inside the apartment. In some cases, he sexually assaulted the victims before killing them. He later admitted that sexual desire and financial gain were his motives. The killings were not impulsive. Shiraishi prepared his apartment specifically to avoid detection. He installed shelves, storage containers, and tools for dismemberment. He discarded some body parts and household trash, which was removed through routine garbage collection. Neighbors later reported foul odors, but no one intervened. The murders might have continued if not for one key factor. In October 2017, the brother of a missing woman began investigating on his own after police progress stalled. With the help of a woman who contacted Shiraishi under a false identity, he arranged a meeting. Police were alerted and followed up. When officers arrived at Shiraishi's apartment on October 31st, he did not attempt to flee. When asked about the missing woman, he told them directly that her body was inside a freezer. Officers entered the apartment and discovered the remains of 9 victims. The scale of the crime shocked Japan. During interrogation, Shiraishi confessed fully. He admitted to killing all 9 victims. He explained his methods in detail. He did not claim that the victims had committed suicide, despite early media framing that suggested suicide pacts. Court records make it clear that the victims did not consent to being killed. The male victim was killed for a specific reason. He had been searching for one of the women Shiraishi had already murdered. Shiraishi stated that he killed him to eliminate a witness. Shiraishi was charged with multiple counts of murder, sexual assault, and body desecration. His trial focused heavily on the use of social media and the responsibility of online platforms. However, the court ultimately centered its verdict on Shiraishi's actions, not external factors. In 2020, he was sentenced to death. His appeals were denied. In June 2025, Takahiro Shiraishi was executed by hanging. The facts of the case reveal a pattern of calculated exploitation. Shiraishi did not search randomly for victims. He actively sought out women who were already expressing despair. He did not offer help. He offered proximity. Once that trust was established, the outcome was predetermined. Authorities later emphasized that none of the victims died by suicide. The narrative of mutual death was rejected entirely by the court. Each death was classified as murder. Each victim was recognized as having been targeted and deceived. Shiraishi's case forced a national conversation in Japan about mental health, online safety, and how vulnerable individuals are protected. But the documented record remains clear. The killer's success depended not on anonymity or mobility, but on direct access to private thoughts shared online. The apartment in Zama was not hidden. It was part of a residential complex. What allowed the crimes to continue was isolation. Each victim arrived alone. Each disappearance was treated individually. The pattern only became visible after the bodies were found together. Shiraishi hunted women by presenting himself as understanding and harmless. He did not need force to bring them inside. He needed permission. That permission was granted because of trust built through words on a screen. The violence ended abruptly, not through long-term investigation, but through the persistence of a family member who refused to wait. Without that intervention, the timeline suggests the killings could have continued. Takahiro Shiraishi's crimes represent one of the clearest examples of how modern technology can be weaponized against vulnerable people. There was no long trail of evidence to follow, only messages, only silence, and an apartment door that closed behind each victim. Across different countries and decades, these cases do not form a mystery. They form a pattern. The killers you have heard about used different methods. Some relied on authority, some relied on charm, some relied on movement, others never left their neighborhoods. What connects them is not how they killed, but who they were able to target. Again and again, the victims were women whose disappearances did not trigger immediate urgency. Women living in poverty, women struggling with addiction, women living alone, women asking for help. The violence did not begin in secrecy. It continued because warning signs were minimized or ignored. In Detroit, abandoned buildings hid repeated murders. In Angarsk, a police uniform became a weapon. Across highways, distance delayed recognition. In homes and apartments, trust was exploited. In online spaces, vulnerability was targeted directly. Misogyny does not always appear as spoken hatred. Often it appears as indifference, as delay, as disbelief, as the quiet assumption that certain lives will not be searched for as aggressively as others. The facts show that patterns existed long before many of these killers were caught. Data was available, concerns were raised, families asked questions. In several cases, action came only after the damage was irreversible. This documentary is not about speculation or symbolism. It is about what the record demonstrates clearly. Serial violence against women thrives when systems respond slowly, and victims are treated as isolated cases instead of part of a larger pattern. Remembering these facts matters, not to sensationalize the crimes, but to understand how they were allowed to continue. Please subscribe to our channel if you like this video, and tell us, where are you watching from right now?